Think about how many times you actually communicate every single day. Seriously. That quick text you send, an email to your boss, maybe a long call with your mom. We're constantly choosing how we share things, often without even really noticing. Are we talking or are we typing it out?
It's such a fundamental thing we do, isn't it? And the nuances there are surprisingly deep. We sort of instinctively pick one way or the other based on, I don't know, the situation, how we feel, maybe even who we're talking to.
Exactly. And that's why we wanted to do this deep dive today. Our mission, really, is to unpack these big differences between talking and writing.
Yeah.
Why do we prefer one sometimes? What does that choice really mean for connection or control or even, our identity?
Yeah, and we've pulled together insights from quite a few places, reflections, some academic research notes. That the idea is to give you a kind of shortcut, a way to get well informed on this really basic but complex human thing.
Okay, let's jump in then. So
Yeah.
why talking? Why does that often feel like the default setting for us?
Well, the research points to a few pretty clear reasons. The big one, right off the bat, is the immediate feedback. When you're speaking, you see faces, you hear tone, you pick up on body language. It's instant. It's back and forth.
That immediacy, it feels really freeing, actually. I remember seeing in our notes that idea of no backspace in conversation. It sort of lowers the pressure, right? You don't have to get every word perfect. You're just
Yeah.
reacting, flowing.
Absolutely. It's less about crafting and more about connecting spontaneously. And that spontaneity is huge for expressing emotion.
Oh, definitely. How so?
Well, your voice itself, the tone, the speed you talk, even like sighs or pauses, all that carries emotion so naturally. If you're talking about something difficult or exciting, talking just feels more real, more felt than typing it out usually does. Text struggles with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it probably ties into how we're raised, our social conditioning. I mean, most of us learn to talk way, way before we learn to write. The materials we looked at frame conversation almost as a survival skill.
Right, for making connections, getting what you need, even avoiding trouble. And socially, there's often a reward for being, well, articulate, for charisma, maybe more immediately than for being a great writer.
Plus, it's just easier to start talking, isn't it? The barrier to entry is so low.
Practically non-existent. You need a voice and someone to listen. That's kind of it. Writing often needs, time alone, focus, maybe a certain confidence level.
Okay, so if talking comes so naturally, how do we actually learn it? Is it just built in?
It's a fascinating mix. Humans seem incredibly hardwired for spoken language. Like babies recognize speech sounds even before they're born. And there's this critical period, roughly birth to age 7, where our brains just soak up language almost effortlessly.
So there's a biological push. What does that look like as kids grow?
You see a pretty clear timeline. First, cooing and babbling, maybe 0 to 6 months. Then first words around the 1-year mark. After that, this vocabulary explosion, putting 2 words together, usually between 1 and 2 years old.
Right.
Then, by 2 or 3, you start hearing full sentences, basic grammar. And by 4 or 5, kids are usually pretty fluent conversationalists, telling stories.
Wow. And how are they picking all this up?
Mostly through, well, imitation, interaction, repetition. It's deeply tied to bonding, to attachment, to getting their needs met by the people around them.
So it's less about formal lessons and more about just living and connecting. Talking is just woven into us from day one. But then there's writing. And even with talking being so primal, writing still has this incredible power. Why? Why does it endure?
Yeah, that's the interesting counterpoint, isn't it? While talking is innate, writing offers things speech just can't. Depth, for one, precision. You can go back, revise, reshape your thoughts, structure complex ideas. It forces you to slow down a bit.
Instead of just reacting on the fly.
Exactly. You can organize things carefully, and then there's the permanence factor.
Oh, yeah, huge. Written words stick around. You can reread them, archive them, quote them later. Like the sources said, spoken words just vanish unless you record them. Writing persists. It's a record.
And that persistence, maybe ironically, can actually make vulnerability feel safer for some people.
How do you mean? Safer.
Well, when you write something personal or difficult, you don't have to see the other person's immediate real-time reaction. That distance can be really necessary for some folks to process things or to, share something tough.
It's like having a buffer.
Yeah.
And maybe more of an internal conversation first. Our notes mentioned writing feels more reflective, like a dialogue with yourself. Even when you're talking to yourself in your head, it can sometimes feel a bit like you're performing for an audience.
That's a great point. Writing can be truly solitary exploration. And what's really striking is how differently we learn to write compared to talk. It's not inborn at all, it's taught.
Right, it's a skill we have to actively acquire.
Yeah, it's symbolic, it's abstract, it builds on speech, sure, but it needs visual coordination too. It's fundamentally a cultural invention, not something we just naturally do.
You see that reflected in the learning timeline, too, which starts much later.
Definitely. Scribbling maybe around 3 or 4, starting to form letters at 4 or 5, real sentences and grammar maybe 6 or 7, then building up to paragraphs, structured essays. That goes on well into your teens and even adulthood. It needs practice.
Constant practice, it seems. Why is it so much harder, cognitively speaking?
It just demands a lot more at once. You need fine motor skills for the physical act, plus memory for words, grammar rules, vocabulary, organizing your thoughts. It's a heavy cognitive load. That's probably why it can feel intimidating or like hard work for many people.
So let's recap the key differences then.
Yeah.
Talking starts basically at birth, learned by copying. It's about connection, survival, feels natural, social.
Right. And writing starts later, like school age, learned through instruction, more for documentation, deeper expression, feels more abstract, maybe academic.
And this difference has huge historical implications, right? The whole idea of the privilege of writing.
Oh, absolutely. For most of human history, talking was universal, but writing was incredibly rare. Oral traditions carried culture, literacy was power, basically held by elites, scribes, clergy. Most people couldn't read or write, even just a couple hundred years ago.
It's kind of mind-blowing that widespread literacy, thanks to mass education, is only really a thing of the last, 100, 150 years.
Pretty much. And even now, it's not totally universal. Global literacy was around 86% in 2020. And, just being able to read and write functionally isn't the same as being a comfortable, fluent writer. Many people don't get beyond the basics.
Which brings us right into the modern world and this sort of paradox. We're writing constantly now, texts, emails, social media comments, DMs, probably more than ever before in history.
Yeah, the sheer volume is staggering.
But we often don't think of it as writing, do we?
Not in the traditional sense. Because it's fast, it's often unedited, it feels conversational, we use emojis, abbreviations, it mimics speech.
So even though we're typing all the time, that idea of real writing, like an essay or a formal letter, still feels kind of daunting or different for a lot of us.
Exactly. There's a disconnect there. What does the data actually tell us about our preferences now?
Well, it's interesting. One survey we looked at from Ledferno found texting was the top preference for consumers, about 37–38%. Phone calls were next, around 30%, then email at nearly 20%. If you lump all the digital writing together, it's over half.
So writing in its digital form seems to be winning out in preference.
It seems so. But, and this is a big but, other research like from Harvard Business Review suggests we actually underestimate how powerful voice is for building connection. Even a quick phone call can boost empathy and trust and clarity in ways text just doesn't. So we might be choosing convenience over connection sometimes without realizing it.
That's a really important nuance. And are there generational differences in these preferences?
Oh, definitely. The data generally shows millennials and especially Gen Z lean heavily towards texting and digital messages. They grew up with it.
Whereas older generations, boomers, Gen X, they often still prefer talking, either in person or on the phone, especially for important stuff, business or personal.
Yeah, and academic studies back this up too. Some people prefer talking because they like that immediate social presence, that warmth. Others choose writing because maybe they feel less confident speaking or they have social anxiety.
Right.
It feels safer.
And there was that other study suggesting talking leans more towards expressing emotion, while writing encourages more logical, reason-based thinking, different modes for different goals, perhaps?
It really does seem to align with different needs and comfort levels. So how did we get here? These preferences didn't just appear overnight.
No, they evolved. Our research points to basically 3 big waves of influence that really shifted things. The early internet, then social media, and most recently, the COVID pandemic.
Okay, let's break those down. The early internet, late 90s, early 2000s, thinking like AIM, MSN Messenger.
Exactly. Those platforms made digital writing feel playful, social. It was like learning to talk with your fingers, using emoticons, acronyms like LOL, BRB. It taught a whole generation that writing online could be fast, casual, and a way to bond without actually speaking.
I remember that vividly. Then came the social media wave, maybe the 2010s, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
Right, and that shifted things again. Communication became about short-form writing posts, comments, DMs. often quite performative. Gen Z really grew up in this era. For many of them, texting felt safer, less awkward, more controlled than a potentially messy phone call you could edit yourself before hitting send.
That idea of editing yourself,
Mm-hmm.
it makes spontaneous conversation feel riskier somehow.
It can, yeah. And then wave three, COVID. Starting in 2020, suddenly video calls, voice calls, they came roaring back out of necessity. Zoom, FaceTime everywhere, but that led pretty quickly to Zoom fatigue. People got tired of being on visually.
I felt that.
And at the same time, for remote work, written communication, email, Slack, Teams became absolutely dominant. So the pandemic kind of solidified digital writing again, but also maybe made talking feel exhausting or performative in a new way for some.
Wow. So looking at the big picture of these waves.
What's really key is that each wave didn't just teach us how to communicate, but shaped what felt, safe or natural or even real. Millennials might see writing as cooler, lower pressure. Gen Z often views voice calls as really intimate, maybe even stressful. Boomers might still connect writing with formality.
So it's flipped almost. Talking used to be the default for connection, but now writing often feels like it gives us more control.
That seems to be a major theme. We write to avoid awkwardness, maybe to multitask, or just to delay responding. But we also write to connect, definitely, and to curate ourselves, to build an identity online.
That brings us nicely into these deeper dimensions, doesn't it? This tension between connection and control.
Exactly. And also how we use these modes for identity. Are we curating or creating?
Let's unpack the connection versus control idea first. Talking, like we said, it's immediate, it's vulnerable, it can be messy. You give up control, right?
Yeah.
You might trip over your words, say something you regret, get interrupted.
But that very imperfection, that spontaneity, is often what builds trust. You get the tone, the laughter, the pauses. It feels authentic, raw, almost.
And it's temporary, usually. Gone once it's said. Writing, though, especially digital writing,
Yeah.
that feels like control. You can edit, delete, rewrite. Think carefully before you hit send. It's a buffer.
A significant buffer. And maybe especially appealing now in an age where people worry about misspeaking or being misinterpreted online, the whole cancel culture anxiety. Writing feels safer.
Okay, so that's control. What about the identity part? Curating versus creating.
Well, think about social media. A lot of the writing we do there is about presenting a certain version of ourselves, right? It's a curated self. Your posts, your bio, the emojis you use, even deciding not to reply, it's all part of this performance, building your online identity.
Yeah, definitely a performance sometimes. How is that different from creating identity?
Reflective writing is probably the best example, like journaling or maybe even creative writing. That's not usually about being seen by others. It's about seeing yourself. Trying out ideas, making sense of things, figuring out who you are. It's a space for genuine creation.
So one is outward facing, the other more inward.
Often, yes. Though, of course, really deep conversations can also help create identity, especially if someone really listens or challenges you in a way that makes you see yourself differently.
It really makes you think about how we're constantly switching between these modes online and offline. Are we performing for others, or are we trying to figure things out for ourselves, protecting ourselves with control or opening up for connection?
Are we speaking just to be heard, or sometimes are we speaking just to hear what we think? There's that great insight from the notes. Talking is a mirror. It reflects you in relation to others. Writing is a lens. It lets you zoom in, edit, or reframe who you are.
That's powerful. Mirror versus lens. That tension between connection control and curation creation feels really central to how we live now.
Absolutely. And these choices aren't just about the situation or the technology. They're also tied deeply to our own internal wiring personality, cognitive styles.
Right, like the difference between internal and external processors. Can you explain those?
Sure. Internal processors, they generally need to think things through before they speak. They might pause a lot, prefer writing to clarify their thoughts, or need quiet time. Often seen as reflective, maybe private.
Okay, and external processors.
They're kind of the opposite. They often figure out what they think by talking. Speaking helps them organize ideas, solve problems. Silence might feel unproductive to them. They might even sound a bit scattered while they're processing out loud, but that's their process.
That distinction makes so much sense. And does this connect to neurodiversity at all?
It can, yes. For example, some people with ADHD find that talking things out actually helps them focus and manage abstract thoughts. Whereas some people on the autism spectrum, or ASD, might prefer writing because it gives them more processing time and reduces the social pressure of face-to-face interaction. Differences in verbal working memory, how well your brain holds on to spoken information, can play a role too.
Interesting. What about personality types, like Myers-Briggs?
Yeah, there are often correlations there too, though it's not absolute. Introverts often find writing more comfortable, fitting their internal processing style. Extroverts might need conversation to really get their ideas flowing, that spark you mentioned, even if they're good writers. And you might see tendencies like judging types who like structure and control, leaning towards writing, while perceiving types who like spontaneity might prefer talking.
But the main point here isn't that one way is better, right?
Not at all. These are just different modes of processing information and expressing ourselves, different tools for different minds. Neither is superior.
So a question for you listening. When do you feel clearest? Is it while you're thinking quietly, while you're writing, or while you're talking it out? And have you ever felt misunderstood because maybe your way of processing just didn't mesh with someone else's? It's worth thinking about.
Definitely. Now, maybe we can zoom out even further and touch on the sort of philosophical core of talking versus writing. What deeper meanings do they carry?
Okay, let's go there. What's the first big contrast?
Well, we touched on this, but ephemeral versus enduring. Talking is fleeting. It's in the moment. It demands presence. Writing lasts. It invites legacy, reflection. What you say might shape a moment. What you write could potentially shape history.
Wow, okay. What else?
Raw versus constructed. Talking often reveals the unedited self, slips of the tongue, raw emotion, just authenticity. Writing is deliberate. It's usually a curated version of truth, or at least a carefully chosen one. Talking shows who we are, maybe, while writing can show who we want to be.
That's a fascinating distinction.
Then, relational versus solitary. Speaking almost always needs another person. It emerges from connection, or at least the potential for it. Writing fundamentally starts as a dialogue with the self, even if the ultimate audience is external. It often begins in isolation.
And the direction feels different too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Talking feels more horizontal, bouncing between people, fluid, lateral. Writing often feels more vertical, reaching down into the self, or up towards posterity, maybe a higher power, or just out into the void. It often strives for depth, while talking seeks resonance.
Like reaching versus bouncing.
Kind of. And then there's the origin. Speech is primal. It's evolutionary. We evolved to talk. Writing is an invention, a technology, a cultural tool we created intentionally.
So speech is innate, writing is intentional.
Exactly. And think about what each carries. Your voice carries so much of your identity, accent, emotion, rhythm. It's a sensory fingerprint. Writing strips that away. Identity has to emerge through word choice, structure, style. Your presence speaks in talking, your perspective speaks in writing.
That's profound. Presence versus perspective.
Also, real-time versus time travel. Talking happens now. Writing lets you send a piece of yourself into the future, or bring the past into the present. Writing collapses time. You can literally have a conversation with someone long dead by reading their words, or write for people not yet born.
It's a way to transcend our own lifespan.
In a sense, yes. And both are survival tools, but on different scales. Talking helps you survive the immediate moment, social dynamics, getting needs met right now. Writing helps humanity survive across time-preserving knowledge, laws, stories, culture.
That's a huge scale difference. But we also need to remember, neither of these is neutral, right?
Absolutely critical point. Neither is neutral. Talking has historically favored certain kinds of people, maybe extroverts, men in many contexts, those with immediate power. Writing, for centuries, favored the tiny educated elite, the privileged. Both have been tools for liberation and oppression, for connection and control. How we communicate is always shaped by power, and it always shapes power in return.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground here, delving into just how rich and complex these basic acts of talking and writing are. It's so clear they both play these incredibly distinct, totally vital roles in our lives, in our culture.
Absolutely. And the takeaway isn't really about picking a winner. It's about understanding their unique powers, their limitations, and just being more aware of the choices we make and why.
So as you go about your day, maybe pay a little closer attention. Notice when you choose to talk versus write and what that feels like, what impact it has. And here's a final thought to maybe mull over something from our notes. Writing is slow thinking. Talking is fast feeling.
That's a good one. Provocative.
It is. And it leads to these crucial questions for you to think about. What happens when you do the wrong one for the right reason? Or maybe you use the right one, talking when you need connection, writing when you need precision, but you do it in the wrong place or with the wrong person.
Thinking about that might reveal something really interesting about your own communication, your relationships, and maybe even how you shape your own world one word at a time.